Welcome to Unpacking Reactivity, episode 6. My name's Dave.
I'm Buddy.
And today we're going to be looking at equipment specifically, so we'll be running you through that. Now, before we get started on that, our hidden word for today is
Tinny.
So the first two people to indicate the exact time slot that Buddy says that word, you'll be getting 2 of our beefy unicorn balls each. And what does tinny mean?
Yeah, for those in North America, a tinny is a can of beer.
Can of beer.
Can of beer. Summer for us, not for you, sorry. So, beer time.
Indeed.
So, yeah, we'll talk about some equipment stuff today, huh?
Yeah, cool. All right, well, let's get the ball rolling. I guess the first thing I think that we talk to our clients about a lot and we talk to each other about a lot is quality, buying quality gear.
Yeah, like, I think when I'm running classes in a private, the first thing, like as soon as the dog gets out of the car, they walk in the building, I'm always doing a scan of like, what are you using? And so we get a mixture of things that you can tell are really low quality. We'll get people that'll put like a string on a carabiner and hook that to the lead. Like, so because it is so confusing, some people will just take easy options, but like I cannot stress how important it is to just buy good equipment off the front end. You won't have to buy it again. Like some of you may know, I'm raising a puppy now. I'm using all the same equipment that I had with Huck, my previous puppy. So if you buy good stuff, it lasts and it's just so much better.
Yeah, it lasts a bit. So there's going to be a few different layers to this conversation today. The first part really is just around management and broadly speaking, safety. But then we're going to get into the next component of it, which is how leash pressure essentially accelerates and decelerates behavior when we're talking about reactivity. So we're going to get into the specifics of that in a little bit. So let's just talk a little bit about types of equipment that will keep your dog safe for starters. So there's a couple of items that come to mind.
Yeah, so it depends, I guess, on what age the dog's in. I guess the first thing is that the equipment has to fit, yeah? When anything we're doing, loose fitting, or if there's anything insecure, if the buckles are coming loose, if the leather's getting worn, that stuff has to be fixed right away. And I'm sure you've seen the bad end of when that does go wrong. But I think that the two things is for the consumer, it can get a little bit confusing with what's out there. And it's because, like, I'm sure you've seen targeted Facebook ads of like, this equipment will fix this right away. Yeah. Like, it's just this, there's promises of that equipment will save you. And I think we want to get into not only how the equipment doesn't necessarily do that. There has to be training involved and the dog has to understand what it is, but it also, it's the blanket statements that we just want to avoid, and we want to go just with the general understanding of the dog has to know what the equipment means.
And it's ultimately probably, I would put a ratio on it of about 15-20% good gear, 80% training. So you do need the right equipment to be able to train your dog. Like, you can't turn up and play a game of basketball in a pair of socks and a football. It's going to be very hard to bounce and shoot the ball. Equipment does matter, and it is very, very important. But ultimately, it's you and your ability to work that equipment. But looking at things like a collar, for instance, I'm talking about safety, buckle. So you're looking at you want a stainless steel buckle or a brass fittings. Both are going to hold up extremely well. So if you're buying a collar, and every dog should have a well-fitted collar, make sure that it won't firstly slip off the dog. Secondly, that you've got the attachment point or the fastening point is extremely robust and strong. Now, there are some very good clips on the market that you can get, but most are rubbish. So very rarely would I put some sort of a clip collar attachment on a dog unless I knew that clip was rated, and ideally it should have a locking system on it as well. Second to that, if we're talking about safety, muzzle. There is no point putting your dog in a situation where they're gonna cause another dog harm, potentially, if that is the type of dog that you're working with and dealing with, which then ultimately means the dog is in the hands of council and the court system. That is extremely unfair to your dog. We can condition muzzles in a way that makes them realize that this essentially going on leads to fun activities, and there's no discomfort with a well-fitted muzzle. So the dog can still eat through a muzzle like this. This is the Baskerville muzzle. So muzzles are an essential tool. I've been dealing with a couple of clients in recent times who have dogs that may be put down in the near future due to incidents occurring. So we want to really minimize the chance of those.
That can be avoided.
Those things ever occurring. And two of the factors that will generally keep you out of that space entirely is well-fitted collar, a very good lead that you know is not going to snap and break, and a muzzle.
Yeah, for more, we won't get too into that, but more, we do have videos on conditioning this process. Take your time, but every dog, you can't go wrong. It's just an insurance policy that you can have.
All right, so I guess moving on from the safety equipment, we'll roll into the types of equipment that you can be using to work through this behavior mod program. So maybe we'll start with harness. You want to talk about harnesses?
Yeah, so harnesses as a whole are not, like, I don't lean on these as, I don't really exclude any equipment. I'm never going to be like, we're never going to use that. I really like harnesses, but I like them for ways not necessarily doing any sort of behavior mod obedience or anything like that. What I use harnesses for, I'll use them for like a puppy, for example, and I'll start doing some environmental stuff while they're in a harness. I can teach some play in a harness where I teach them, hey, the ball might go over there. We can teach some retrieving and things like that. And some free time, recall practice, stuff like that. But as far as anything goes, if we're dealing with any sort of reactivity, anything like that, for me, this is not a go-to device in that situation, but there are places in it for training for me.
So these harnesses traditionally we use for sport, so teaching dogs to pull. So sled dogs, or or biting dogs, strangely. So this tool creates typically a lot of opposition reflex, frustration in the dog. The dog leans into it, they get excited. It's a bit like going and getting ready to play, I don't know, a grand final, and your coach is holding you back at the gates as you want to run out. It builds a lot of excitement, and adrenaline is paired with that. So it's very much, and we'll get into it once we go through this discussion, an accelerator of behavior and problem behavior. So this can be a big part of people's issues. So this in itself, though, is what we would call more of a sports style harness, but there are other types of harnesses as well, no pulling harnesses, which have some upsides and lots of downsides. You want to speak to them?
Yeah, sure. So the no harness, so this is just, this has a chest plate on it, but a no pull harness might have a clip right here, and the lead will go there. Okay, and so the idea of this is that if the dog decides to pull, it sort of spins them. And what I find with them is some dogs kind of figure it out and they're okay on it, but a lot of dogs actually just sort of get pissed off because they'll pull and then they'll spin and then they'll get really frustrated. So they'll try and pull harder, and then the harness will start to spin and things like that. So as far as if I want to teach a dog to loose lead walk or any sort of behavior mod, you won't see me use a harness in that situation.
Yeah. And people will talk about harnesses being better physiologically for dogs. Well, there's lots of evidence to dispute that. A lot of harnesses actually mess with a dog's gait as well and how they naturally walk.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of problems with harnesses as well. I'm not saying collars don't have their downsides as well. They absolutely do. But ultimately, we're just trying to look at lesser evils in regards to some of this. But no pull harnesses. Anyone who's tried, if you've got a dog that has significant issues in this space and you've tried to use a no pull harness, I'm sure you can make some comment in our comments that the dog ultimately will end up pulling through it, and it doesn't give you any real level of control when things happen to blow up.
And
so
just to be on the other side saying as well, so this does, sure, I see a lot of dogs that walk very nicely on a harness, and that's cool, that's great. Like I'm all for it if it works for you. I'm just gonna say, as far as like a fixing tool, it's probably going to work against you for the majority of people, but if it works for you and your dog is cool on it, awesome.
There's always cases where these things will go against our general principles, and that's completely fine. Good, but for now, goodbye harness.
Bye harness.
We need you, muzzle, but we don't need you right now. All right, moving on from that, the next thing, and we don't have an example here because we rarely use them, is a head halter. So I want to speak a little bit about head halters. So a couple of things. A head halter is something that fits over the dog's snout and gives you essentially head control. And the principle of a head halter is, so it sort of fits over this part of the dog's snout here. If the dog goes to lean into it, then the dog's head would fold down, and you can use pressure to pull the dog out and away. So head halters actually do work in terms of suppressing behavior. So they're one of the most suppressive tools that you can buy in terms of developing a dog. Now, the thing with our program is we're not looking for absolute suppression. We're actually looking to redirect that dog's emotion to something more positive and to shift emotion. So, and it becomes a very challenging thing to do, to work a dog in with some food chasing games or even play when the dog has this on. It actually becomes quite dangerous. So there are some cases, like everything that we do, there are some cases where we absolutely suggest that a head halter might be a good option. And that's typically if the handler has a lot of difficulty handling the dog. So it might be an elderly person or a person who finds it a little bit difficult to handle the strength of their dog. Well, there can be some times and reasons why we might switch to a head halter for purpose and for use. However, our advice, it doesn't fit in with our program. So that's why we don't advise it as generally as a tool that we would use in terms of this program. Sometimes people will use it thinking it's not aversive, like something like a slip lead might be more aversive because you're sometimes actively applying some pressure. And we'll talk about how we apply pressure today using a slip, and you'll see it's very mild. But that head halter is actually applying a lot of pressure without you doing anything. Essentially, the dog just leaning into it in this action. And for dogs that are wary of the environment, so a dog that is either a bit defensive, wary, or even prey-driven dogs, that notion of them not being able to control their head and space and all those sorts of things can make the process a lot worse. So that you are purely relying on suppression to then do it. And look, if programs that typically suppression is an important tool if carefully used for aspects of your development, and it should be used periodically. A bit like my son should know, even if he wants to punch his auntie, that he shouldn't do that. And we're not always going to just give him lollies for not punching her. We're going to tell him, don't do that. So suppression is certainly a part of what we're trying to do, but a program that is reliant on suppression as 95% of its model is a shitty way to train. Yeah.
And again, no absolute statements. It's for me, it's always going to be a horsepower issue. It's always like if the dog is too powerful for the handler, then we do it. But it's a good analogy that you put that way. It's like if you're claustrophobic by nature, then all of a sudden I take your hands and I shove them into your hips and don't let you move your arms. You're just coiling a spring at that point. So not a staple of our program at all. Again, if they work for you, that's great. But yeah, we always will try and move to something that allows the dog to change that emotion somewhere else.
Yeah. And really from there we move to collars. So the benefit of a collar. So a big part of our program is essentially dependent on you having a level of head control in the dog. So one of the problems that we have with, and we'll talk about angles in a second, but one of the problems that we have with this type of behavior mod program is face-to-face. My daughter was quite upset that I was bringing her, it's named Spotty, by the way, so Spotty to work today.
Does that one have a name or not?
No.
Ken.
Spotty and Ken. Yeah, that's a good name. The issue that we typically have with this when doing behavior mod is the dog lunging and pulling forward and squaring up on something else. So the problem with harnesses and a lot of other devices is you can't get the dog to pivot out of that space. So we do a lot of behavior mod where the dog is cruising around sort of more on a parallel angle to the dog, and in doing that we avoid the jacking up. So this squaring off, there's very, very few carnivores in the world that would see the same species cruising along the forest or the savannah, and an unknown animal that they didn't know, and if they were squaring up on each other, that would nearly always lead to two things: conflict or mating. Rarely does it fall outside of that. So not much good happens when the dogs are going cruising up to each other straight on. Yeah. So anyway, back to equipment. A collar enables you to at least get the dog out of that situation and pivot and move them around. So we're looking for a level of head control in terms of this. So a collar is something that we would certainly look at. Do you want to talk about slips?
Yeah, sure. Do you want to just standard lead first?
Yep.
So just standard lead. So just the reason I think these are good to talk about, these do come in different lengths. So this is a 2 meter lead. They come in 2, 1.8. You can get a 1.5, 1.4. So depending on the dog, that works. I think my worst nightmare in these situations where we're doing any sort of behavior mod is the dreaded bungee lead, because that dog will now, all your control and finesse goes out the window. So if this is I guess just a type of strap lead, which I really, really like. I have about 5 of these. I really enjoy these. These are the Hebrew leads. But this type of lead for me is much better. It's easier to handle than any of the rope style, or you can get these with a big plastic handle on them. Mm-hmm. And for me, all of that is just unnecessary. It's bulky. It makes it harder to use. So just get yourself a nice flat lead like this, where we can use the loop. We can shorten it as we need. It doesn't have any extra play in it, and you can get a height that a lead that suits you. So I'm a quite tall guy, so I always don't necessarily need 2 meters. I can go to a smaller one. It just depends on who you are.
Yeah.
And then so slip leads here. So a slip lead is pretty basic. You'll see a lot of vet practices and things like that use these, where there's a little stopper on it, and then it goes over the top of the dog. It's important that this actually gets set up. If I can go through the camera, if you're using these to actually have this where the ring is on the top here, because that does matter of how this releases. But this just sort of sits on the dog, and then as we condition this, we teach the dog, hey, they can come off that pressure, and then we can do a lot of like rewarding for them, hey, yielding to this pressure, and they learn, when I feel this, I'm just going to come this way with it. And it's quite a fair way for the dog to understand, hey, come this way. Again, technique is super, super important here when you use these.
Yeah. All right, so let's start talking about acceleration versus putting the brakes on, essentially in terms of behavior. So I'm going to get rid of that. Spotty can stay, and Ken, you can come over here. So the first thing, I'll just do it on my wrist to start. So as Buddy mentioned, if we're using something like a slip, and this could be the same as the collar and lead setup, one of the first things you want to teach your dog away from this entire setting is to yield to the pressure. And we just do that as simple leash pressure exercises, where we apply a little bit of pulsing pressure, and the dog is marked and rewarded. And the dog learns that feeling and sensation of the pressure coming on means I just go directionally that way. So one of the things that we want to be very, very careful of when we're working dogs as well is big lead for you, mate. Okay, so is if the dog is cruising down the street, one of the biggest issues that we're going to have is if Ken sees Spotty and really dislikes Spotty, if I pull and create pressure straight back through the lead like that, so even though this is a slip lead, this is going to sit probably back on a piece of muscle on the dog here, and we're going to have almost exactly the same issue that we would have if the dog was wearing a harness. And it's going to greatly accelerate behavior. So it's just creating excitement. So when we're coming down, this is why the footpath is so problematic in terms of training and development with these dogs. But if the dog is coming down the footpath and sees another dog straight on, and then you're pulling straight back, that's a very similar technique that you would use if you were training a dog for bite sports. You would be pulling a little bit of back pressure on the dog, that would be building frustration, and then at some point you would release the dog and the dog would go and do whatever the intended purpose is. What we actually want to do in this point in time when these things happen is step out 45 degrees. So rather than pulling back this way, we step out this way and we pivot Ken around this way. And as soon as we get a little bit of momentum, then we start to try and get a little bit of engagement with Ken, and we start doing an activity with Ken. So that's the first thing to understand. We don't want to be pulling directly back. You want to step out 45 degrees and then pulse Ken. So in this situation, Ken would already know how to yield to pressure, although this situation, Ken is a little bit excited because he's got a little bit of adrenaline running through him. We'd say his name, Ken, which should indicate please pay some attention. We might cue him to come this way, and then at that point we can pulse, and as soon as Ken starts to give us a little bit of focus and energy, we can feed this way. But that is if you end up in this scenario, and this is what we want to avoid at all costs. So when we're working dogs in this scenario, what we're ultimately trying to do is this. So one of the biggest issues we have with the footpath, for example, is Spotty comes around the corner and Ken is cruising up the street, and at this point can explode. Now, I've got a little Chihuahua cross at home. If he's cruising up the footpath and a Great Dane, for instance, comes around the corner and he's a bit of a defensive dog, my little guy, that would be the same in terms of size to weight difference. That would be the same situation as me cruising down the footpath and then coming up and a bull elephant coming around the corner, and then me looking up at that bull elephant and thinking, what am I going to do in this situation? Going back to that scenario we were talking about before about straight lines and the issues with a lot of dogs. Now, we're not talking about dogs that have low drive, that are super social, that have just grown up around lots of dogs, and a lot of this is genetic. So you'll find that a lot of dogs that have less dog type things in it, so less prey, less aggression, all things that essentially make a dog and help them for survival, all of the things that create these problems for you are ultimately things that would enable your dog to probably do quite well in a natural scenario. The dogs that have less of those things, so are a bit more homely dogs, then those dogs would probably not care. Whatever comes around the corner is fine. Now, how well they would actually do in a survival situation, if they were getting like hunted down, that's a different story. But for a lot of dogs that have any issue like this, the straight line on the footpath is going to create significant issues. So we typically suggest that you don't do any of this training on the footpath. You're looking for scenarios to work your dog where you can work them parallel. And just by keeping your dog in this parallel scenario, and I'll take that off for a sec, and working them in a level of engagement up and down while this, can you just move Spotty up and down please for a second? While we're having fun here, Ken is aware that Spotty is there, but if we can do some food chasing and fun activities or some play here while this is happening, well, we are in fact changing emotion. So one of the best places you can actually do this and practice this is just out front of your house. You can just go out the front of your house if you've got a bit of footpath, obviously. We would appreciate some of you are in different living situations, but if you've got a little bit of footpath out the front of your house and you can sort of see either side and you're not going to get spooked by a dog coming out of a weird place, that would be a great place to start. Going to the outskirts of a dog park, same thing, just working parallel. All of your issues, and I want you all to take a very, very keen note of this, but all of your issues are going to happen when the dog squares up. And quite often in workshops here, so in workshops here, what we do is we'll bring a dog out, we'll have a more neutral dog that will be a test dog, and the rule is quite simple with that dog. It needs to remain parallel, not squaring up. So we often get our trainers to handle that dog. If we can scoop even a dog that has significant levels of leash aggression reactivity coming into the picture and keep it parallel, we can actually get the dog generally reasonably close. Now, when I say reasonably close, within about 4 or 5 meters. But generally, the client has not had the dog in that scenario for a very, very long period of time without extreme explosion. And the reason is simple. It's just purely because we're maintaining that angle. So whatever you do, don't do this. And even in terms of keeping things parallel, I try and get the dog to turn away from the dog. Because if we turn the dog into the dog in terms of this direction here, that moment can be a point of explosion as well. Okay, so the dog's cruising along, try and get them to whip around this way. Whip around this way. Not cruising along, whip around this way. And please, when you're out working your dogs and developing your dogs, check this moment out. That half or split second where the dog is facing that way, that's probably where you're going to find most of your issues are occurring. So you want to be able to go do this. Now, keeping in mind, we've given you 5 episodes before this looking at things that build your relationship, build your engagement,
that lead to this,
build your the obedience process, the communication process with your dog. So that's what you're using in this part. And we only need the leash pressure if this part happens and the dog starts to explode this way. Pulse back this way, so it should be directionally pulsing back this way, and then back into the other components that we've talked about. The next episode of this is going to be a bit of a what are we calling it? The next episode is a brief of the entire process.
Oh, so, a review. Sorry, I'm looking at the prompt. But
okay, so yeah.
Just a couple things. So I really like, and I still use your in your reactivity seminar. Your big saying is beat adrenaline, which like beat the adrenaline response, which I really like. I really like that. So once the dog's, if you have quite an intense case of this, once the dog's gone, get him out of there. But we need to avoid that as much as possible. The more the dog can practice that behavior, the more often it's going to be reinforcing and happen again. So that's one thing. Always try and beat the adrenaline, as Dave says. The other thing is, and guys, I've been here before, like this is why I became a dog trainer, is the technique here, like Dave's talking about, is so important, is because what will happen is we'll be going down the path and we can beat the adrenaline because we see Spotty and we go, hey, here we go, let's get going. But the initial response for a lot of people, and this is why you should come see us or work with an experienced trainer, is because what's the first thing? They go, shit, dog. And then what's the first response? Be cool, everything's calm, no problems here, everything's calm. And the dog goes, okay. And just like our bite sports, we can turn this into, hey, go. And it becomes a cue for the dog. So the technique is so important that this lead is loose, and we just use our angles. So yeah, I know Dave covered most of it. I just want to say I've been there before. I know what this is like, but technique is so important because there have been several cases, I'm sure you've done it too, where I grab a dog and based on simply my technique of the lead, the dog acts differently for me than it does for the client. So
completely, and yeah, exactly, and keep that pressure off, because the moment that sits on at any angle, ultimately for more than a second or two, the dog is accelerating. So that's why we're talking about pulsing, not pulling pressure. Pulsing pressure, and we're not ripping a dog's head off. The pressure is very much measured, and you'll find if you're getting the dog to pivot, you're actually working with the dog ergonomically. And the pressure required to get a dog to pivot around, if you're on the right angle, the other part of that is keep it at the dog's neck height. Okay, so it's at the dog's neck height. It's not much at all. You'll find it's fairly minimal pressure.
I always joke, if I were to follow you with an air horn behind you while you walk your dog, and I turn the horn on every time your lead was tight, would it sound like me going ding, ding, or would it sound me going bang the entire time? So if you can think about me following you with an air horn, how much is that horn going off because the lead's tight? So
Yep. And you brought up another really, really good point, which I just want to touch upon as a final point on this subject, is beating the adrenaline.
Tinny.
Tinny. What's a tinny?
Tinny's a can of beer.
Beating a
Didn't want to forget again. I've done that on a previous episode. Sorry.
Beating adrenaline. So it's really, really important. One of the things I often hear from people coming, maybe from other training places or just trying to work through things themselves, but certainly from some other training schools, and there's a lot of amazing training schools out there, but some of the training schools is that, oh, my dog goes into a class environment and at about 6 or 7 minutes, the dog will settle. That's not helping you in any capacity. So going back to the beat adrenaline point, you have got about 1 to 3 seconds max to get the response that you're after. There's crazy urgency because the issue you have is not 7 minutes in. When you're walking down the footpath and the dog blows, the dog comes and goes
you
like
don't get
that.
7 minutes.
You don't get 7 minutes to work something. We've got to start changing the emotion the moment the dog sees that other thing. We want the association of the dog seeing that other dog to be of less value. And to realize that this is the time to do something with the handler that's far more fun, not to go and blow up and do all crazy things on the end of the lead. So it's really, really important to understand that 1 to 3 seconds is really important. If the dog has a massive adrenaline surge, well, you're in emergency management. And at that point in time, all you need to do is actually pivot the dog and get out of there. Don't try and do any sort of behavior mind, just leave. Because, and as we know, if you've had that significant adrenaline spike, it takes you considerable amount of time to come off that. We've all been in that situation where you've had a big scare and you know it takes you considerable time to think about your dog. But if you can change that within about 1 to 3 seconds, then and pull that energy and even get a bit of that adrenaline response with you and in play or whatever, then you'll find that the dog ultimately starts to get actively better to a point where they start looking for you when like the other dog becomes an indicator that something fun is about to start with you. So you don't have 7 minutes. It's not about letting the dog go right up and then bringing the dog back off and waiting till the dog's essentially dead tired and now look, the dog's wonderfully behaved. That's not helpful. You have 1 to 3 seconds. It's also not helpful to be 150 meters away down the field when these things happen. We've touched upon this on earlier episodes. That will stimulate more prey in some dogs. So this approach and technique is designed to actually get this parallel movement is designed to get the dogs actually in a reasonable space, not one dog here and this is dog out here and the dog takes a step in anytime it looks at the handler. That's not helpful. We're trying to do something that's active and more close. So just a couple of things to think about. But I think
It was a good one.
that's about it.
It's a good one.
Cool. All right, that's equipment. So we will be coming back for a summary of the whole process in episode 7. So we hope to catch you soon. Bye.
Bye.